Hello, I'm William Cook, and this is my video presentation of my research project. The subject is going to be the Salem witch trials. So my research originally was supposed to be penned around the Christian impact of the Salem witch trials and how the Puritans had moved forward afterwards, given that these trials were ultimately looked at by historians as misguided or hysterical on many cases. And my research changed my thesis statement to reflect as such. Now, the Salem witch trials, a little bit of background, in about the late 1600s, around 1692, in the towns of Salem, Andover, and Topsfield, Massachusetts, cities just north of Boston, there was an outbreak and a cry for witchcraft. Now, this started with two girls. They were the daughters of the reverend in the town. Reverend Samuel Parris. We'll talk more about him later. But his daughter started to experience some unheard of or unfamiliar characteristics that were unfamiliar today. Now, the problem was doctors these days, when they did not understand something, they were quick to blame the devil or witchcraft. And that's exactly what happened. What followed was a series of mass accusations that were driven from social statuses, he said, she said arguments, disputes over land, and often there were trials that were very misrepresented for those accused. Now, the research, like I said, was originally going to be driven by the impact that the Salem witch trials had on Christianity. However, during my research, that took me a different direction. My thesis statement is this: the Salem witch trials were a result of paranoia and misuse of biblical scripture, and ultimately had a favorable impact on Christianity's judgment in the future. The town of Salem, Massachusetts was far from an ideal village. The Salem witch trials began with the hiring of Reverend Samuel Parris. Now, Samuel Parris initially did not have the most ideal background. Samuel Parris came from Harvard as a dropout, so his reputation was already tarnished, but he negotiated a salary, land, and a home for his family, moving to Salem as the first ordained minister. Now, initially, the transition was very smooth, but then he started to express more of a theologically conservative stance and wanted to bring religion back to Salem. However, in doing this, he was very strict, very pro-tax for the church, and this divided the village into several factions. Now, Samuel Parris had a daughter by the name of Elizabeth Parris and a cousin, Abigail Williams, living with him. Now, these two began to be what some would call troublemakers and began to undertake experiments in fortune-telling and became involved with Tituba, their slave that was from Barbados. Now, a lot of these were devised around social statuses, who they might marry, and stuff that seemed childish at the time. But suspiciously, around the beginning, what started and sparked the Salem witch trials was unexplainable behavior by both Abigail Williams and Elizabeth Parris. Abigail and Betty's episodes that they were having were described as beyond epileptic, so there was no real understanding for it. Now, the red flags that were thrown up at the time from historians is that they were able to turn their episodes off and on, especially when being examined. So that looks back now as a front. Now, the problem with this was the Puritans were so religiously bound, and they were caused by mass panic that they were quick to believe Satanism, Satan involvement, devil worshipping, witchcraft, because it was out of fear and it caused hysteria. Now, the girls eventually threw out names. Amongst the first was Tituba, who was a slave in the Reverend Parris household. Now, she came from Barbados, so she was an easy target. Her ethnic background was quick to point the finger at. Others accused were Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne. Now, during these trials, they would brought forth between a Jonathan Hawthorne, and he would examine them prior to it being brought to trial. So he would examine Tituba, and he would grill her on questions on whether or not she was involved with witchcraft. After hours of the court trials, of the examination and the questioning, the girls during this were acting hysterical. They were acting as if Tituba was possessing them in the courtroom. So an eyewitness account from the judge, and also eventually Tituba broke down and confessed to witchcraft and named several others in the village, including 9 that she did not know the name of. That is where the witch hunt began. The trials in Salem were anything but fair. There was a great outside influence in the Salem trials by a writer by the name of Cotton Mather, who had previously written about witchcraft, and that gained interest with some of the most important figures inside of the trials, the people running it. He wrote a publication called Curiosa Americana, where he demonstrated that that smallpox had killed his son, that this was the devil's territory, and that we had been appointed here by God, but the devil was still present. He talked about how the devil afflicts people and takes their body in order to torment others. And so when the girls started acting hysterical, this gathered the audience that Cotton Mather had gathered with his writings was easy to believe. One of the books he wrote, "They which lie must go to their father, the devil, into everlasting burning. They which never pray, God will pour out his wrath upon them, and when they bed and pray in hellfire, God will not forgive them, but there they must lie forever. Are you willing to go to hell and burn with the devil and his angels?" It was very harsh, very direct, we must kill the witches. So the accusations were very heavily weighed on others. So along with outside influence of Cotton Mather, there was also a big social intervention of the accusations. And now, I mentioned earlier, the village was divided into different factions, some that were pro-church, some that were against the church. One of the accused was Sarah Osborne, who was an elderly lady who had not gone to church in over a year, and the poor church attendance was considered a sin by the Puritans. Sarah Good was another one accused, and she was a homeless woman that went door to door begging for money. So they all fit the mold of a social status outcast for the Puritan village, and they were easily accused. And once they were accused, it was nearly a guilty verdict. Another suspicious act taken during these witchcraft trials was when those who were accused, they were also stripped of their land, and this was in line with a previous dispute over land that the Puritans had, that the ones that were pro-church would go against the ones that were not. Giles Corey was one of the individuals who was accused, and he had a land dispute with the leaders and the churchgoers. Now, he was interviewed for witchcraft, and he refused to answer the accusations. He was then pressed to death, and when they asked him the questions about witchcraft, he replied simply with, "More weight." Now, the end of the trials caused a lot of scary numbers. 19 people were ultimately hung from this. One member, Giles Corey, was pressed to death. That was a method of interrogation. They would continuously add bricks on top of him or stone, trying to get information out of him. At least 5 were killed or died in jail. Now, the jail conditions in Salem were not good. During the winter, it was an ice box. During the summer, it was a furnace in there. And to make matters worse, when they were in jail, their comfort was paid for by themselves. So if they wanted fresh straw or fresh hay to lay on, that was something that they had to pay for. If they wanted more food, that was something that they had to pay for. So they had to wait in these miserable conditions. And several people passed away in these conditions. And a lot of them would confess to witchcraft because the conditions were believed to be so miserable, is what is believed. Now, ultimately, the Salem witchcraft trials have gone on to take a very eerie impact. However, the judges and the jurors have ultimately refused to admit guilt for the most part. Now, several of them, again, blame the devil. The devil was at work. The devil corrupted them, and the devil was loose in Salem. There was a lot of damaged reputations and friendships and relationships in Salem afterwards. After the trial was over, those that were accused were not released from prison. They were maintained in prison because they had to pay to leave. And if they could leave, their land was gone. So there was no reason for them to leave. So the relationships were heavily damaged, and Reverend Samuel Parris was in jeopardy of losing his job afterwards. He was eventually removed from Salem Village as the Reverend. Samuel Sewall was one of the 9 judges that were on the trial as one of the individuals that convicted those of witchcraft. He was one of the only ones that after the trials confessed to wrongdoing and felt guilt. He had a Reverend Samuel Willard read his confession at one of the congregations in Boston. It read as follows: Samuel Sewall, sensible of the reiterated strokes of God upon himself and family, and being sensible that as to the guilt contracted upon opening of the late commission of Oyer and Terminer at Salem, to which the order of this day relates, he is upon many accounts more concerned than any that he knows of, desires to take the blame and shame of it, asking pardon of men, and especially desiring prayers to God, who has unlimited authority, would pardon the sin, and that all of their sins, personal and relative. So in summary, I claim that the Salem, Massachusetts witchcraft trials were driven from mass hysteria, jealousy, social statuses, and he said, she said. A lot of it was at stake and just thrown out at accusations by jealousy, land disputes, and again, social status structure. So the Salem village was split into 2, a lot of them that were for the church, a lot of them that were against the church, and it was a very clear accusations from those for the church going against those against the church. And when they were in prison, their land was being seized by those making the accusations. So it was a very questionable act to look back on. Well, because it is commonly believed that the trials were wrong, that there was not a fair trial, there was not right representation. An accusation is all it took in order to find a guilty verdict, and that led to the hangings, 19 individuals. So when you couple all this together and then they back it up with their biblical terms, biblical references that you shall not let a witch live, that's where it becomes questionable of the sanity of the Puritans. Now, they believed that they were doing the right thing out loud and on paper. They were doing God's work. However, when it was all said and done, they were quick to, some of them, including Mr. Sewall, he had openly admitted and asked for forgiveness, and every year took on fasting and asked for repentance and asked for God to punish him and not those who are trying to recover, and asked for their forgiveness. So there was a very clear sense of regret, sense of guilt amongst those involved, but most of them never directly admitted that they were wrong. It was Satanism, it was the devil worshippers, it was witchcraft. It was a lot of fear-based accusations and fear-based actions against witchcraft. Now, we still saw it today. Very recently, we had the Red Scare with the McCarthyism. Those who were believed to be supporting communism, an accusation was all it took, and many were brought into trial based on an accusation. Now, that's the epitome of what the Salem witchcraft trials were all about. However, there has been a positive impact from this. We all learn from our mistakes. We're growing. Now, this is a pretty big mistake and an inexcusable mistake. However, now we have much better trial. We have much better representation for those accused in the trial. It's no longer eyewitness accounts that can carry a guilty verdict. So I believe that the Salem witch trials, from my research, have had ultimately a positive impact, not from the trials itself, but learning from a significant mistake. We are better now than we were during the Salem witch trials, and it took a horrendous example of how to handle those accused to learn from it.